I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply. This is the most arrogant, yet most honest statement Nathan Rothschild left to posterity. On the battlefields of early 19th century Europe, life and death were often decided not by the caliber of muskets or the range of artillery, but by a secret weapon overlooked by most military strategists. This weapon had no smoke, no weight, and was even invisible. It consisted of sheets of parchment filled with numbers, a mathematical game played in the shadowy back rooms of banks. This is the story we are going to tell. How the Rothschild family used this secret weapon to turn France into Britain's logistical supply station right under Napoleon's nose. To tell this story fully, we cannot sit in a comfortable office discussing finance. We need to go back to the Franco-Spanish border in November 1813, standing in the freezing rain of the Pyrenees. If you stood in Arthur Wellesley's, later the Duke of Wellington, camp back then, you wouldn't smell victory, but the scent of rotting corpses and despair. This British expeditionary force had been fighting in the Iberian Peninsula for 5 years. In London newspapers, they were heroes. In reality, they were beggars. According to a diary left by one of Wellington's aides, soldiers' boots had rotted on their feet. Some had to wrap raw cowhide around their feet, tied with hemp rope. Once the hide dried and hardened, it would slice into the skin like razor blades. But that wasn't the deadliest part. The deadliest thing was no money. By no money, we don't mean the British government lacked a budget, but that there was no hard currency. The British government sent massive amounts of treasury bills and pound notes to Wellington every month. But in the Spanish mountains of that era, these papers were waste paper. Local Portuguese muleteers, Spanish grain merchants, and even peasant women selling eggs refused to accept paper money printed with the English king's head. They only recognized one thing: Spanish dollars or French gold Napoleons. This currency mismatch led to horrific consequences. To survive, British soldiers began selling their equipment at shocking discount rates. A fine Brown Bess musket could only fetch 2 bottles of cheap red wine on the black market. Even more terrifying, this army, styling itself as liberators, was forced to start pillaging its allies because it couldn't afford food. In December 1813, during an inspection, the Duke of Wellington found his soldiers tearing down local farmers' houses for firewood and stealing all their livestock. The Iron Duke made an extreme decision. He hanged 20 British soldiers involved in the looting in a single day. Their bodies hung from roadside olive trees, swaying in the wind. He wrote to Earl Bathurst, the Secretary of State for War, "If we cannot pay in cash, this army cannot advance, nor can it even survive. If this situation continues for another month, I won't have to wait for Napoleon to act. I will have to disband the troops myself." Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte sneered as he stared at the coastline on his map. Although he had suffered a setback at the Battle of Leipzig, he held a trump card more lethal than 1,000,000 troops: the Continental System. This was a physical iron curtain. From the Baltic to Gibraltar, ports across the European continent were closed to British ships. Napoleon's gendarmerie patrolled the coastlines day and night. Their orders were simple. Any goods from Britain were to be burned immediately upon discovery. Anyone assisting the British was to be shot on the spot. This created a deadlock. London's vaults were piled high with gold and silver looted from colonies. But just a few dozen nautical miles across the Channel, Wellington's army was on the brink of collapse due to a lack of money. This wasn't just a military blockade, it was physical isolation. Transporting tons of metal currency across enemy lines to a battlefield thousands of kilometers away without modern transport was considered an absolutely impossible mission at the time. Until the British government found that fat man living at New Court in the City of London, Nathan Rothschild. On the late night of January 11, 1814, John Charles Harries, the commissary-in-chief, knocked on Nathan's door. The message he brought was brief. Wellington is finished. We need money, not paper notes, but gold and silver. Nathan showed no surprise. In fact, his private intelligence network was faster than the government's. He had long been preparing for this. But he faced his first technical difficulty: insufficient chips. To save Wellington, at least 100,000 pounds in metal currency was needed every month. In terms of weight, if it were gold, that was about 800 kilograms. If silver, nearly 12 tons. And the stock of precious metals in the London market had long since dried up. Nathan executed a maneuver that seems chilling even today: intercepting the East India Company. At the time, although Britain was at war, the commercial machine of the British Empire was still running. The powerful East India Company was preparing to send a massive fleet to China and India. By custom, this fleet was loaded with about 800,000 pounds of silver to purchase tea, silk, and spices in Asia. This was the last massive amount of spot silver available in London, and indeed, all of Western Europe. Nathan realized that once this silver set sail, Britain was truly doomed. He had to intercept this shipment. But he had no administrative authority. He only had money, and something sharper than money: insight into human nature. Days before the fleet set sail, Nathan began a frantic buying spree in the London financial market. He didn't ask the price. If anyone sold gold or silver for paper money, he bought it. This move rapidly drove up the market price of bullion. Immediately after, he approached the directors of the East India Company. He didn't talk about patriotism. He talked about profit. He directly offered a sky-high price that the directors couldn't refuse to buy all 800,000 pounds of silver. The directors of the East India Company hesitated. If they sold to Nathan, this year's Asian trade would be ruined. If they didn't sell, they would lose this ready-made windfall.
As agreed, sir.
Just then, Nathan utilized his government connections. He had the Treasury apply pressure, but that was just a front. The real killer move was telling the East India Company, if you send this money to China, you are turning silver into tea. If Napoleon wins, who will you sell your tea to? But if you sell the silver to me, I can fund Wellington to win this war. Only if the war is won will your stocks rise. This profit plus fear combination punch worked. The East India Company sold the 800,000 pounds of silver to Rothschild. Overnight, Nathan Rothschild became the largest cash dealer in Europe. The British government was shocked to find that this Jewish crocodile had cornered the ammunition depot. They had no choice but to entrust the transport of these funds entirely to Nathan. But having the money was just the first step. The real problem was how to transport it. With 12 tons of silver, plus a steady stream of gold to follow, you couldn't transport it like ants moving home via smuggling boats. In the storms of the Bay of Biscay, the loss rate for this method was as high as 20%. Moreover, if a single ship were intercepted by the French Navy, this huge sum would become Napoleon's war funds. Nathan sat in his office at New Court, looking at the map of Europe on the wall. His gaze didn't rest on the smuggling points along the coast, but landed on the enemy's heart, Paris. He took out his secret weapon. This weapon wasn't high-tech. It was a piece of paper, scientifically known as a bill of exchange. In that era, most people saw a bill of exchange as a simple IOU. But in Nathan's hands, it was a quantum weapon capable of penetrating any physical defense line. His plan was insane to the extreme. He wouldn't just break through the blockade, he would use the blockade. He would get Napoleon's government to personally greenlight the very funds that would destroy it. Does this sound like a fantasy? No. This exploited a massive blind spot in the economic understanding of the French High Command at the time. To understand Nathan's plan, one must first understand the economic model in Napoleon's brain. Although Napoleon was an artillery genius, in economics, he was a mercantilist living in the 17th century. The core logic of mercantilism is crude and simple. Gold equals national power. In the eyes of monarchs of that era, the total amount of global wealth was fixed. Trade was a zero-sum game. If gold flows from Britain to France, France wins, Britain loses. If gold flows from France to Britain, France loses, Britain wins. The fundamental purpose of Napoleon's Continental System was to stop the European continent from buying British goods, thereby stopping the flow of gold to Britain. He wanted Britain to suffer a credit collapse due to gold depletion. Nathan keenly grasped this bug. He asked himself a question: what if I voluntarily send gold into France? If Britain voluntarily transports massive amounts of gold into France, what does that look like to Napoleon? According to mercantilist logic, this is Britain bleeding out. This is France sucking dry the enemy's reserves. This was a massive cognitive trap. Napoleon only saw the surface phenomenon of gold flowing into France, but he ignored the second law of finance: liquidity. Gold entering France didn't mean it would. In the early spring of 1814, the air in Paris was thick with tension. Although the armies of the anti-French coalition were still looming at the borders, skyrocketing prices and material shortages had already left this bustling capital on edge. At this critical juncture, a young man named James Rothschild walked into the French Finance Ministry building on the Rue de Rivoli. This was the most perilous part of the entire plan. If Nathan was doing math in London, James was walking a tightrope in Paris. He was only 22 years old, a Jew holding a British passport, and his brother was the official financier of the British government. By all rights, the moment he stepped onto French soil, he should have been sent to the guillotine. Yet, he became an honored guest of the French Minister of Finance, Count Napoleon. Why? Because James brought with him a bait that no finance minister could refuse: shorting Britain. The dialogue between the two was not recorded in detail, but based on later Rothschild family letters and fragments from French financial archives, we can reconstruct this classic psychological gambit. James did not show any sign of asking for help. On the contrary, he adopted the guise of a rapacious merchant. He told Napoleon, "Count, London is in chaos. That stupid British government, in order to maintain a false prosperity, is strictly prohibiting the export of gold. But capital seeks profit. My brother Nathan tells me that the wealthy in Britain are desperately trying to move their assets out and exchange them for the more stable French franc." At this point, James lowered his voice and sprung his fatal logical trap. "If we do the opposite, If the French government allows this panicked British gold to flow into Paris, we will not only earn massive transaction fees, but more importantly, we will be draining the last drop of Britain's blood. When London's vaults are empty, their pounds will become worthless paper, and Wellington's army will mutiny because they cannot be paid. Count Napoleon was a typical bureaucrat who believed deeply in mercantilism. In his view, as long as gold flowed out of an enemy country, it signified the enemy's defeat. He completely failed to realize that this gold was not fleeing for safety, it was coming to fight. Napoleon was tempted, but he needed one final procedure: the emperor's approval. At the time, Napoleon was busy commanding his armies and had little energy to delve into such specific financial details. When Napoleon's report was submitted, Napoleon saw only the conclusion that fit his expectations. The British are bleeding. And so, with a stroke of his pen, Napoleon approved this operation, termed Special Financial Transit. With that signature, he not only signed a pass for the French finance ministry, but he also signed the death warrant of the French Empire. With the imperial decree in hand, the Rothschild war machine kicked into high gear. Over the next few months, the English Channel witnessed one of the most absurd scenes in the history of human warfare. At the northern French ports of Gravelines and Dunkirk, ships flying neutral flags, which were actually smuggling vessels hired by the Rothschilds, began to dock. On the wharves, the French Coast Guard, who should have been on high alert, were now obsequiously assisting porters in unloading the cargo. Heavy wooden crates were carried off the ships. The crates bore nondescript commercial markings, but inside, they were filled with gold coins bearing the head of King George III and bars of high-purity gold. Months earlier, these captains would have been hanged immediately. But now, they waived special passes issued by the French finance ministry. It got even more ridiculous. To ensure that this gold, supposedly flowing into France to strike a blow to the British economy, arrived safely in Paris, the French government actually deployed the gendarmerie to escort it. Imagine the scene. On the royal road to Paris, a convoy of carriages loaded with British gold is speeding along. Flanking the carriages are Napoleon's gendarmes, riding tall horses, wearing blue uniforms and bearskin hats. They watch the surroundings vigilantly, protecting this treasure from bandits. Passing French peasants might have tipped their hats, thinking this was war booty the great emperor had seized from the British. In reality, Nathan Rothschild was using French horses and French roads to transport the very blade that the Duke of Wellington would use to kill them. The gold arrived safely at Rue Lafitte in Paris, the location of James Rothschild's bank. But this was only the first step. The gold was now in Paris, still hundreds of kilometers from the front line. If British gold coins were transported directly to Wellington and intercepted by French troops at the front, not only would the charge of aiding the enemy be proven, but the entire plan would be exposed. At this moment, the secret weapon, the bill of exchange, made its formal entrance. Here, we need to get a bit technical and break down the working principle of the bill of exchange. It was this mechanism that allowed the Rothschilds to achieve quantum teleportation of funds. After receiving the gold, James did not transport it out of Paris. Instead, he made a move that made the French financial world cheer. He sold the gold and bought francs. Massive amounts of gold flooded the Paris market. Instead of causing panic, it stabilized the French monetary system. This convinced the Napoleonic government even more that the Rothschilds were helping France. With huge amounts of franc cash in hand, James began looking for targets within the Parisian banking circle. He was looking for bankers who had business dealings in the south of the country, in Spain and in Portugal. He would approach a banker and say, "I have francs. I want to buy the debts owed to you in Madrid or Lisbon." The other party would be delighted. During wartime, collecting cross-border debts was a massive headache. Now that Rothschild was willing to use cash francs to buy these hard-to-collect debts, why wouldn't they agree? And so, the deals were struck. James paid out francs and received stacks of bills of exchange. These bills read something like this: "Upon presentation of this bill, please pay the bearer 1,000 Spanish dollars from XX Bank in Madrid." This step was a true stroke of genius. Laundering. The British gold stayed in Paris, becoming reserves for the French banking system, which made Napoleon happy. Invisibility. The funds transformed from heavy metal into lightweight paper. Leverage. Effectively, it was French bankers who were preparing the payment for Rothschild in Spain. James then dispatched his legendary team of couriers. These couriers were often disguised as ordinary Jewish merchants, drifters, or even wounded French soldiers. They sewed these thin bills into their collars, hid them in the soles of their shoes, or even rolled them inside cigars. Riding fast horses, they passed through layer after layer of checkpoints in southern France. French sentries would check their carriages for contraband and search their luggage for weapons, but no one would carefully scrutinize a few crumpled commercial notes in a merchant's pocket. Even if they saw them, they assumed they were ordinary business correspondence. In this way, these invaluable slips of paper passed through Napoleon's defense lines like a virus, crossed the Pyrenees, and finally arrived at Wellington's tent. In February 1814, the Duke of Wellington's paymaster walked into a bank in a Spanish border town once again. This time, he didn't bring unwanted paper pounds. Instead, he slammed stacks of bills of exchange signed by Rothschild onto the counter. In those chaotic times, a king's promise might be worthless, but a Rothschild signature was harder than gold. Seeing the bills, the Spanish bankers didn't ask questions. They opened their vaults. Box after box of heavy Spanish dollars were carried out. The Duke of Wellington exclaimed in his diary, "Those damned dollars have finally arrived. The sound they make is more melodious than any military band." With real silver and gold, the British Army was immediately transformed. Wellington issued a strict order. All supplies must be purchased with cash. Looting is strictly forbidden. This move was more effective than any political propaganda. Farmers in southern France were surprised to find that these English-speaking invaders were more generous than the French emperor. They paid fair prices, and they paid in hard currency. Consequently, farmers who had been hiding their grain began to voluntarily drive their cattle and sheep into the British camps. Village women who had been poisoning French soldiers began washing clothes for the British. Local French guides even volunteered to lead the British Army around French defensive lines just to earn silver dollars. This is the terrifying effect of weaponized money. French Marshal Soult, while defending Toulouse, discovered in despair that although he was fighting on his own soil, it felt like enemy territory. He couldn't requisition grain or recruit soldiers because he only held devalued French assignats, while the British across the field held clinking silver dollars. Napoleon's proud logic of "people's war" was completely overturned. It wasn't that Britain conquered French territory. It was Rothschild's silver dollars that bought the hearts and minds of France. In April 1814, Napoleon signed his abdication at the palace of Fontainebleau. But in the weeks leading up to that, something happened that Napoleon would not understand until his dying day. When French Marshal Soult was making his final stand in Toulouse, southern France, he found that the British troops facing him were not only well equipped, but were followed by long supply convoys. In contrast, the French soldiers wore tattered shoes. The national treasury was empty, and their pay was 3 months in arrears. With a touch of dark humor, just as the Battle of Toulouse began, the Paris Mint, hundreds of kilometers away, was working overtime. What were they doing? They were melting down the British gold shipped by James Rothschild and recasting it into French francs and gold Napoleons. James then sent these brand new gold coins to Wellington through his network of bills of exchange to purchase the gunpowder used to attack the French army. This was the true reason for Napoleon's defeat. It wasn't because of the rain at Waterloo, nor was it because Marshal Grouchy was late. It was because his opponent possessed infinite ammo. And the pipeline delivering this infinite ammunition was authorized by Napoleon himself. During this financial smuggling operation that lasted for months, the Rothschild family funneled over £12 million into the European continent. Adjusted for purchasing power, this is equivalent to billions of dollars today. If you piled these silver dollars up, they would be enough to build a silver bridge to Paris. When the coalition forces entered Paris, Tsar Alexander I and the King of Prussia checked into luxury hotels in the city. Guess who provided the cash services for these occupying forces behind the scenes? It was James Rothschild again. The banker who, just months earlier, was helping Napoleon suck Britain dry, had now transformed into the official treasurer of the anti-French coalition. He wrote coldly in a letter to his brother Nathan, "Now, all the emperors of Europe are queuing up to see me. Now, we must address the elephant in the room, Waterloo." The most widely circulated story about the Rothschilds goes like this. Nathan used carrier pigeons to learn of Wellington's victory a day before the British government. He walked into the London Stock Exchange, face grim, and began frantically selling British consols, government bonds. Others thought Britain had lost and sold in panic, causing a crash. Then, Nathan bought at the bottom. The next day, the news arrived, bonds skyrocketed, and he made a 20-fold profit. This story is exciting, and it fits the anti-Semitic stereotype of the greedy banker perfectly. But it is false. This story first appeared in a French anti-Semitic pamphlet in 1846, 10 years after Nathan's death. True history is more hardcore than rumors, and it demonstrates far greater financial wisdom. In June 1815, Napoleon's 100 Days began, and the Battle of Waterloo broke out. Nathan did indeed possess the fastest intelligence network of the time. His courier, Rothworth, jumped onto a speedboat the night the battle ended, braving a storm to cross the channel. Nathan did indeed learn of the victory a full 24 hours before the British government. But he didn't go to the exchange to crash the market. In fact, the liquidity of the British bond market at the time was poor. If a market maker of Nathan's size led a sell-off, the market would have frozen instantly, and he would have had no chance to buy back such a large volume at the bottom. He did the opposite. He was buying frantically. Why? Because Nathan Rothschild was betting on a bigger game. Before Waterloo, to fund the anti-French coalition, Nathan had hoarded a massive amount of gold. This was because, during wartime, gold is more valuable than paper money or bonds. But what did it mean if Napoleon lost? It meant peace. Peace meant army demobilization, so less military pay was needed, causing the demand for gold to plummet. Peace meant the government no longer needed to borrow heavily for war, so the issuance of national debt would decrease. Peace meant economic recovery, and the British government's credit would rise. This was an extremely high-difficulty macro hedge. Nathan realized that once Wellington won, the hoard of gold in his hands would depreciate, because no one urgently needed gold anymore. To hedge against the risk of gold depreciation, he had to make it back on British consols. So, the moment he learned of Napoleon's defeat, he knew gold was going to fall and bonds were going to rise. Not only did he not crash the market, but he poured all the family's cash and even borrowed money to frantically buy British consols. He wasn't betting on the outcome of a single battle. He was betting on the national fortune of the British Empire for the next 100 years. History proved him right. After Waterloo, the price of British bonds rose by more than 40% in 2 years. Considering the leverage attributes of bonds at the time, the Rothschild family's wealth multiplied several times over in this operation. But this money wasn't earned through fraud. It was earned through a precise prediction of the macroeconomic cycle. While everyone else was staring at the tactical map, he had already seen through to the post-war economic cycle. After 1815, the smoke cleared. The monarchs of Europe were surprised to find that although Napoleon had fallen, they had a new master over their heads. At the Congress of Vienna, Austrian Chancellor Metternich, the man known as the coachman of Europe, privately told his aide, "The House of Rothschild has a special status in France, Britain, and Germany. We can hardly make any financial decisions without considering their opinions." This was not an exaggeration, because while the war was over, the bill remained. To win the Napoleonic Wars, the British government had incurred massive debt, and the largest holder of this debt was Rothschild. The nature of power had shifted. Previously, if a king lacked money, he could raise taxes, or even default and kill the creditor, like the Knights Templar. But under the modern financial system of the 19th century, if you dared to default on Rothschild, your national credit rating would go to zero, you could never issue national bonds again, and your government would go bankrupt immediately. By controlling the bond market, the Rothschild family effectively gained veto power over the British government. A classic example occurred decades later, in 1875. British Prime Minister Disraeli was dining with Queen Victoria. He suddenly received intelligence. The Khedive of Egypt intended to sell his controlling stake in the Suez Canal, asking for £4 million. This was a golden opportunity to control the lifeline to India. But the problem was, the British Parliament was in recess, and the Prime Minister couldn't get authorization for the funds. If he waited for Parliament to reconvene, the French would have bought the canal long ago. What did the Prime Minister do? He didn't go to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Instead, he sent his private secretary directly to the home of Lionel Rothschild, Nathan's son. At that moment, Lionel was having dinner and was about to put a grape into his mouth. The secretary said, "The Prime Minister needs £4 million tomorrow." Lionel didn't even put down the grape. He asked just one question. "What is the collateral?" The secretary said, "The British government's credit." Lionel ate the grape and said, "You shall have it." The next day, £4 million was transferred. Britain bought the Suez Canal. This is the embodiment of power. In that instant, the Rothschild family were not just bankers. They were the backup treasury of the British Empire. Having told this story, we can now answer the question. What exactly was the secret weapon with which the Rothschild family defeated Napoleon and controlled Europe? Was it the bills of exchange escorted by Napoleon's police? Was it the legendary carrier pigeon that flew across the Channel? Or was it their gold reserves, rich enough to rival nations? Number. These were just surface manifestations. The true secret weapon was a dimensional strike on the protocol layer. Napoleon was a player who pushed the physical layer to the extreme. He had the best artillery, the fastest marching speeds, and the tightest blockade lines. He tried to cut off the world's connections using physical means. The Rothschild family, however, were players gaming on the protocol layer. They understood, in this world, The flow of capital, information, and credit follows logic deeper than physical borders. When Napoleon saw gold flowing into France, he saw physical blocks of gold. Rothschild saw that once this money entered the banking system, it could instantly transform into a weapon to strike French troops through the protocol of bills of exchange. This is what is called cognitive asymmetry. In any era, whoever controls the underlying financial protocols and information networks can play with opponents who only understand brute force. Napoleon lost because he tried to stop flowing water with a brick wall. Rothschild won because he turned himself into water. The bills of exchange in this story are just like the Mongol horseshoes we discussed before. They look ordinary, even boring. But it is these underlying details, ignored by the big shots, that become the fulcrum to move the earth at critical moments in history. If you want to understand history, don't just stare at the person on the throne. Look at who is keeping his ledger, who is transporting his supplies, and who is setting the invisible rules of the game. That is where the real secrets hide.